Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Bryan. I teach 11th grade U.S. History at Mary G. Montgomery High School. Today we're looking at the Alabama State Standard for 11th grade history students, number 15. And it says this: describe changing social and cultural conditions in the United States during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And I want to direct your attention to the board beside me as we look at our essential question and our objectives. So our essential question is, what international and domestic tensions resulted from the Cold War? Our objectives: number one, identify how America's fear of communism impacted American society. And the second one, analyze the extent to which fear of communism caused restriction of freedom in the United States. So our goal today is, we're looking at society in the 50s and 60s primarily, but we're going to set the stage for the Cold War. And we're going to study how the Cold War impacted American society. We're going to look at the fear of communism. We're going to look at the fear of nuclear fallout. And we're going to look at various wars of containment and really focus on Vietnam next week. But beginning this week, let's set the stage. World War II ends, and at the end of World War II, when the dust settles, there are two superpowers that dominate the world. It is the United States, which has a government of democracy, and it is the Soviet Union, which has a government of communism. These two government systems are totally opposed, and these two countries are bitter rivals at the end of World War II. So the United States and the Soviet Union, the way the end of the war happened and the way certain things played out just helped to set this rivalry. The United States kept the atomic bomb, which ended the war, a secret from her allies, the Soviet Union specifically. Well, the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, he refused to allow free elections, which he had promised that he would do, and he refused to give back a portion of Germany, as we'll see in a second. So there's reasons why these countries are bitter rivals and why they exit World War II and enter a new era of the Cold War as rivals. So let's define, before we move on, the Cold War. And you can compare it to what I would think of as a hot war, where two countries are in direct military conflict, like any war. But the Cold War is different. The Cold War is an extended period of conflict and tension in the world. And this Cold War is going to dominate American foreign policy for nearly 40 years. We're going from 1945 to 1992, the early 90s, when we see the Cold War end. So it's going to dominate American foreign policy and have a big impact on American society. Now, what I would like to do is quickly identify the United Nations. So on the board, you can see beside me a poster identifying the unity of the United Nations and also an emblem. The United Nations began in 1945 and is still around today. It's an international organization of countries to promote peace in the world. It's very important to understand that as we move forward, because I will reference back to the United Nations. Now, in Europe, I want to use this map to explain certain things that are going on. So you know that as the United States and Great Britain began pushing toward Berlin at the end of World War II, they're coming from this region toward Berlin. Well, the Soviet Union is moving this way toward Berlin. Well, you can see that all of this area in red is areas that the Soviet Union conquered as they were moving toward Berlin. Now, Germany, if you'll turn your attention right here on the screen, you have West Germany and you have East Germany. Well, Germany, at the end of World War II at a conference, it was decided that it would be divided among the victors of the war, the Allies. So the United States had control over a portion of Germany, and Britain had control, and France had control, and the Soviet Union. And all of these countries promised that they would turn Germany back over to the people of Germany. Well, Britain and France and the United States did that, but the Soviet Union did not. They laid claim to East Germany and refused to allow it to go back to the people, or refused to allow free elections in any of the countries, including East Germany, that you see on this map. Now, countries that were controlled by the Soviet Union and which were communist countries after World War II are called satellite nations of the Soviet Union. They are communist countries under the control of the Soviet Union. The term to describe this division in Europe is called the Iron Curtain. Now, there was no wall and there was no curtain or fence in Europe to divide, but if you'll look at the map with me, it is just a political barrier where to the east of this barrier you have communist countries, and to the west of this barrier you have democracies. Now, the United States adopted a policy of containment during this war, which we're going to come back to in a second. Now, this next slide, I really want to look at Germany as a whole. So again, Germany is divided. Well, if you will look closely in East Germany, remember this is a satellite nation. This is a communist country under the control of the Soviet Union. Berlin, which is the capital of Germany as a whole, is in this communist portion. Well, Berlin was divided at the end of World War II as well, where you had the Soviet Union controlled the eastern portion of Berlin, and the other Allies controlled the western portion. So just like Germany as a whole, you had a divided Berlin. Well, Stalin saw an opportunity where he could blockade Berlin and claim all of Berlin for the Soviet Union. So he did that. This cartoon on the right shows you a line of tanks with Stalin drawn blocking Berlin. And it was a war of attrition. He believed that if he could block all trade, all goods from coming into Berlin, eventually the Allies will turn Berlin over to the Soviet Union. Well, the United States and our allies came up with a plan, and it's called the Berlin Airlift. And you can see again on this cartoon on the right side, Allied planes coming into East Germany, dropping supplies to the people of Berlin so that they would not starve and they would not go without. Well, Stalin eventually realized that he could not win. There was nothing that he could do, and he released the Berlin blockade, and the crisis was avoided. Now, moving forward, I briefly mentioned a second ago a policy of containment. The United States adopted this policy where we're going to prevent communism from spreading to any country that it does not exist. Now, satellite nations of the Soviet Union, if communism stays there, that's fine. But if it threatens another country, we're going to get involved with our military and we're going to stop the spread. As you will see later, it's going to get us involved in some international conflicts and wars. So containment is probably, I tell my students, one of the most important key terms as far as foreign policy in modern U.S. history is concerned. So on the screen is President Truman. Let's read this together as he explains containment. He says, "At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based on the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation, control by armed minorities, or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own distances in their own way." So he's saying that there are two governments. There's freedom, which is democracy, and there's communism, which is the few controlling the many. Now, to help explain containment, I'm going back to this document. I want you to see one more time. These countries that are in red that are communist countries, we're not worried about invading them and pushing communism out. We're worried about countries that are not communist countries that are threatened by communism. And for this example, let's say the Soviet Union invades Austria, which is in this map a democratic country. That's when containment would come in, and that's when the United States would mobilize and push communist aggressors out of the country. Now, this goes along with another policy called Domino Theory. And to understand Domino Theory, we've got to ask this question: why containment? Does containment really protect American national security? Well, we've got to think of that in light of the fact that Stalin did believe that communism would spread around the world. So the U.S. leadership believed that it was in America's national interest to adopt a policy of containment. And Domino Theory is very simple, that if one country in the world is allowed to fall to communism, then it could cause another country to fall, and another country, and another country, until eventually, the right side of this cartoon, the United States is threatened. So Domino Theory is like setting up a row of dominoes, knocking over one, and it's a chain reaction. And it's a policy that went hand in hand with containment during this time. A war of containment that we fought was in Korea. Now, what happened to begin the Korean War was at the end of World War II, the Japanese that controlled this part of the world in Korea, south of this 38th parallel, surrendered to the United States. The Japanese who invaded this part of Korea in the north surrendered to the Soviet Union. So it resulted in a divided Korea initially, communism in the north and democracy in the south. You can see on the far left side of the screen, June 25th, 1950, how the north invaded the south. So we saw that as communist aggression moving into a free nation. So according to Containment, the United States would get involved. So you can see in the second map, September 14th, 1950, the north had pushed all the way down just about to the end of the peninsula. And we believe that the Soviet Union was supplying the North Koreans to be able to push down that far and that successfully. Well, the United States, the UN, United Nations, commanded by Douglas MacArthur, came in and pushed nearly back toward China. Well, at this point, the Chinese get involved and push back to the 38th parallel. So it seems like a seesaw back and forth. Well, at this point, Douglas MacArthur said our war is with communist nations such as China who were fighting in Korea. He proposed using weapons of mass destruction against China. Well, the President Truman, disagreed, and that did not happen. The end of the war came with an armistice, a ceasefire, a demilitarized zone in Korea at the 38th parallel, leaving Korea to this day just about the way we left it at the end of the war in 1953. So this is again a war of containment. The question is, should the United States have fought in communism in Korea? Should the United States have been involved? And it comes down to this, again, does communist aggression threaten United States national security? Does containment stop aggression that would eventually make it to the United States? So a document that I want to show you really quick on the board, I'd like to read it with you. This is the President making this decision, should we fight in this war? He's riding on an airplane in the document and he has time to think. And let's see what he says. So go into the document. He says, the plane left the Kansas City Municipal Airport at 2 o'clock and it took just a little over 3 hours to make the trip to Washington. I had time to think aboard the plane. In my generation, this was not the first occasion when the strong had attacked the weak. I recall some earlier instances, like Manchuria and Ethiopia and Austria. I remembered how each time that the democracies failed to act, and it encouraged the aggressors to keep going ahead. Communism was acting in Korea just as Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese had acted 10, 15, and 20 years earlier. I felt certain that if South Korea was allowed to fall to communist leaders, would be emboldened to override nations closer to our own shores. If the communists were permitted to force their way into the Republic of Korea without opposition from the free world, no small nation would have courage to resist threats and aggression by stronger communist neighbors. If this was allowed to go unchallenged, it would mean a third world war, just as similar incidents had brought on the Second World War. It was also clear to me that the foundations and the principles of the United Nations were at stake unless this unprovoked attack on Korea could be stopped. So again, I want you to think of this, that the President is saying that if this is not stopped, then communist aggression could make it to the United States. I also want you to consider this, where he's talking about, he's comparing Soviet aggression, communist aggression, to the aggression of the Axis powers at the beginning of World War II, and how they were not stopped and they were allowed to let communism, or not communism, but allowed to spread throughout Europe and the Pacific. So here he's saying that if we get involved, we can stop this aggression lest it become a World War III. He also mentioned the United Nations, that if the United Nations is to work, it must step in here in the Korean conflict. Now, not only wars abroad, not only did that impact American society, not only was that the big fear, but there was two others. Fear of the United States falling to communism here in the United States, and fear of nuclear fallout. Let's start out with fear of communism here in the United States. So there was a belief that if someone was a communist and they served in a government job, that they could guide and shape foreign policy. Well, there was an organization called the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which investigated people in government jobs, and if they found them to be communist, then they would lose their job or be punished in some way. McCarthyism is another way. Joseph McCarthy believed that there was communists within the government, guiding and shaping foreign policy. And he began this process of accusing people of being communists, which resulted in this witch hunt for communists in the United States. Let's look at what Joseph McCarthy said. He said in this document, "This, ladies and gentlemen, gives you somewhat of a picture of the type of individuals who have been helping to shape our foreign policy. In my opinion, the State Department, which is one of the most important government departments is thoroughly infested with communists. I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who would appear to be either card-carrying members or certainly loyal to the Communist Party, but who nevertheless are still helping to shape our foreign policy. One thing to remember in discussing the communists in our government is that we are not dealing with spies who get 30 pieces of silver to steal the blueprints of a new weapon. We are dealing with a far more sinister type of activity because it permits the enemy to guide and shape our foreign policy. So you, again, at the bottom, you see this phrase, guide and shape our policy. That's what he's saying. And this is, in the United States, this is the big fear, is that communists in the U.S. could harm the United States. But it wasn't just in federal positions. It's also in private industry, and especially Hollywood. There were people in the United States who believed that Hollywood had this unique ability to influence people in the United States. They saw that what Hollywood was putting out could be propaganda, and if there was communist messages coming out, it could harm the United States. So the House Un-American Activities Committee was a committee which investigated Hollywood and began accusing people and actors and producers and directors of being communist. And in the process, they called 10 people in Hollywood to testify to try to find out who's communist. Well, these 10 individuals, nicknamed the Hollywood 10, refused to testify. They believed that it was not legal what they were doing. They believed that it was infringing on First Amendment rights of Americans to believe what they would believe. They refused to testify. Well, the Hollywood 10 were arrested and fined and eventually blacklisted, unable to work in Hollywood again. And on the board, you can see these documents that explain this. On the left is a document which shows an image of people protesting, saying, "Set the Hollywood 10 free." On the right, you see a committee of un-American activities. Look at what they're doing. They're running over Americans, damaging them, hurting them, injuring them permanently at times. And at the top, it's hard to see, but it says, it's okay, we're hunting communists. So they're justifying their actions by saying that communism is the true evil, and they're out to find communists in any way that they can. Also, in the process of finding communists, freedom is being restricted in the United States. And these two documents kind of show that. Our First Amendment rights guarantees us the right to speech and to believe what we would believe. Well, on the documents, let's look at the cartoon first on the right. You see this man climbing up a ladder toward a fire. Now, he might perceive that fire to be communism, or he might perceive it to be a threat or whatever, but he looks like he's freaking out. He has hysteria written on his leg. He's going to put that fire out. But if you'll look, this flame is attached to a torch, which is attached to an arm, and all of this symbolizes the Statue of Liberty. So if this is the Statue of Liberty, then that's the flame of liberty. And in trying to put out this flame that is scaring this man, he's really putting out liberties and freedoms in the United States. If you'll look at the document on the left, this senator makes the statement, "The American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds lest they be politically smeared as communist or fascist by their opponents. Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. It has been so abused by some that it is not exercised by others. The American people are sick and tired of seeing innocent people smeared and guilty people whitewashed. But there have been enough proof cases to cause nationwide distrust and strong suspicion that there may be something to the unproved sensational accusations." So freedom of speech in the United States and constitutional rights in the United States are being drawn back during this time. And it leads us to a question that is important for all of U.S. history. What's more important, security or freedom? And in times of crisis and in times of international conflict and national crisis, the question always arises, what are we willing to give up for security? Or, again, what's that balance? Freedom or national security? And that's generally debated in the United States. Now, another fear in the United States is this fear of nuclear fallout. As the Soviet Union develops weapons of mass destruction, America is scared. And they're scared of air raids, they're scared of atomic bombs, they're scared of attacks on the United States. So I know that many schools in the United States would have air raid drills. My grandmother went to Viger High School in the 1950s. And at Viger, she would have air raid drills where they would go out and they would get to a certain safe place around the high school or in the school to practice protecting themselves in the event of an attack during the Cold War. So it hit home here in Mobile. On the board, you can see some of the things that people would do. On the right side of the screen, you see a bunker or a fallout shelter where they would have food and storage of things that they could live underground in the event of an attack. If you look at the left side of the screen, the atomic bomb teetering between world control and world destruction. Well, also, I want you to think of the Cold War as a great competition or a race. We were racing with technology and space research and putting a man in space or a man in the moon or a satellite into orbit. And the Soviet Union beat us at a couple of these competitions, such as Sputnik, putting a satellite in orbit, which provoked the Kennedy administration to push for putting a man on the moon as quickly as possible. So again, we're racing. In fact, without some of these competitions in the Cold War, we might not have the technology today that we enjoy, such as cellular service or satellite television or radio or many of the technologies that depend on satellites. Now, this next slide deals with the Soviet Union in competition, and it talks about at the beginning, it says Nikita Khrushchev, which was the Soviet leader at the time, was almost desperate to beat the Americans at something, anything, and he even boasted that communism would bury capitalism in the United States. Down here, he talks about how they're developing the hydrogen bomb, which is a weapon of mass destruction, and how by developing a missile that can take a satellite into orbit, that same missile could carry a bomb of mass destruction to the United States or the Soviet Union's enemies. So this competition dominates a lot. In fact, one of the events that created some of the most scare was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union planted missiles in Cuba and pointed them at various cities in the United States, where after a long time of conflict, where everybody's sitting on edge, waiting for nuclear fallout, Kennedy and Khrushchev worked together to come to an agreement where Kennedy removes missiles from around the world, promises not to invade Cuba, and the Soviet Union removes the missiles from Cuba. And it leads us to a point here I want you to get at the end. Look at the cartoon on the left. Kennedy and Khrushchev working together, bitter rivals, bitter enemies in this Cold War, to not open the nuclear chest and let the monster out, which would represent the nuclear fallout. In fact, in this document, this next one that I have on the board, Kennedy says, I speak of peace because of the new face of war. He says, total war makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to these forces. It makes no sense in an age when a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all of the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when deadly poisons produced by nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and sea to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. He's calling on nations to pursue peace during this Cold War, to decrease the fear of nuclear fallout. This one, Kennedy proposes a policy called flexible response, where he says that we need to strengthen our non-nuclear forces to fight a war that does not resort to weapons of mass destruction. If you'll look on the board quickly, he says, finally, to those nations who would make themselves our rival, we offer not a pledge but a request that both sides begin anew a quest for peace before the dark powers of destruction unleashed by science engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. He says, and I want to stop here, but he says, we dare not tempt them with weakness. So he's not saying weakening our armed forces. He's saying let's strengthen non-nuclear armed forces so that we do not annihilate life on this planet. The last thing that I would like to say in conclusion is this. The flexible response is a policy which, again, pushes us away from using weapons of mass destruction. However, it's a policy that helps get us into conflicts such as the Vietnam War, which is a war of containment. Again, this war is going to have a large impact on American lives in the 60s and 70s. In fact, next week, that's what we're going to look at, where this week we looked at the Cold War in the early years, the 50s and the 60s, impacting Americans. Next week is the 60s and 70s. It's the Vietnam War, it's the anti-war protests, it's the political turmoil of the 60s, and it's the social movements of the 60s and 70s. It's very important, so be here with me next week. I'm looking forward to going through this lesson with you. See you then.